coming up on this episode of The Roundtable.
The problem is probably 70, 80% of parents either don't have strong feelings on this or are fine with it, but there's 15 or 20% of parents who really want to be able to call their kid or text their kid. And those are the parents who tend to be loudest. So when you're contemplating this as school boards, when you're dealing with this as a principal, you tend to catch a lot of flack from these folks. And the folks who go, oh, yeah, that sounds sensible, tend not to speak up because it doesn't have any direct impact on them. This is actually one of the reasons why tackling this at a state level is so potentially powerful, because it then puts school boards, superintendents, principals in a position where they're saying, look, this has been argued out. Your elected representatives have made a decision. We're simply executing kind of state educational policy in a way that makes them less the bad guy in the equation.
Welcome everyone once again to this special Cincinnatus series we're doing at the Claremont Institute. I'm Ryan Williams, your host, the president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and The American Mind. I'm joined once again by Scott Yenor. Scott and my joke is that, you're going to be on all of these except one, Scott. So you're the ubiquitous state expert. Scott's a senior director of state coalitions at our Center for the American Way of Life in Washington, D.C. We're happy to welcome back Rick Hess, who's a senior fellow and director of education policy at the American Enterprise Institute. And then we're very pleased to welcome a new guest, Clare Morell, who's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and is our resident expert on screens and technology and all that. So I thought we're going to talk today about screen use and children and schools and what state legislators ought to do about this. But we should, I think, set the stage a little bit. So, Clare, if you'd allow me to impose on you,
Sure.
How should we think about this problem? And I guess we could start with what's the main problem of screens and children and school and pedagogy and all the rest.
Yes, it's a big, it's a big question. So I think, the main concern that we've been seeing is that nationally, reading, math, and science scores have just dropped pretty precipitously to the lowest scores that we've seen really since they started collecting these scores in like the 1970s. And particularly, they started dropping post 2010 when we saw this big kind of push in kids getting access to smartphones and social media, and also screens becoming much more common just in the classroom as part of learning. And so the kind of academic effect of screens is probably the most pronounced. I think, though, also increasingly data has shown that having screens in the school environment, particularly students having access to smartphones and social media, is also very disruptive to student relationships and in-person interactions. And so it's contributed to this rise in mental health issues like anxiety and depression and loneliness among this rising generation. And so having these devices be part of the school day, which is both children's primary academic environment, but also their primary social environment, and where they're really learning social skills by interacting with their teachers and with their peers, have both been critically undermined by smartphones, social media, and then also just the kind of push for screen learning we really see is not panning out. And I've written on this, but there's a lot of studies that show that children just do not learn literacy and reading comprehension as well through a screen as they do using real books, paper and pencil, to help them learn their letters and establish really the building blocks for literacy. So the kind of the myth sold by Silicon Valley that one laptop per child was really going to solve our educational achievement gap has actually really been quite the opposite.
Yeah, you also, I forget when I read it. It was maybe 5, 7 years ago, but there's the interesting fact that the really fancy private schools in Silicon Valley,
That's right.
where the tech moguls send their kids, are screen free.
Exactly. No, and I think that just really speaks to the kind of elitism of a lot of these, Silicon Valley elites, that they are not allowing their own children access to these devices because they know the harms, and they are sending them to schools without screens because they realize it's not what's best for learning. But at the same time, they're pushing ed tech on all the rest of the schools. And so we just see that disparity continue to increase.
Do you have a sense of the macro statistics across? I guess we could just start with the elephant in the room, which is our K through 12 public institutions. I mean, how widespread or penetrated are the public schools with permissive approaches to screen use?
Wow, I don't have a statistical analysis, but I can tell you anecdotally that almost every parent I've spoken to says in a public school system, that the tablets and the Chromebooks are being pushed at younger and younger grades, so that now basically K through 12 kids are assigned a tablet, and they're increasingly relied upon by teachers. That it's not really just, oh, okay, occasionally we pull this tablet out to do an exercise, but it's pretty much constant throughout the school day. And so they've completely replaced books. I was talking to a parent that said, actually, our school got rid of textbooks completely. There are no textbooks in the school anymore. It's all through the tablet, which also makes it incredibly difficult for individual parents to opt out. And particularly parents who have children with learning disabilities or learning challenges or ADHD say that they want to be able to opt out because the screens are actually very dysregulating to their child. And they just don't even have the choice because this is how assignments have to be completed. And this is the way they are actually being taught, is all through the learning device in the classroom.
Yeah, and then you mentioned social media as well.
Hmm.
Is there a noticeable inflection point? I mean, I mean, Facebook sort of broke onto the college scene, I think in '04 ish. Uh, and then the first iPhone, I think, was in '09 or 2010. Um, and so there's this whole social side to it too. And it's even infected college, just the ubiquity of social media. And of course, our main delivery, or the main delivery device these days, is the smartphone. I remember my colleague Charles Kessler had an experience with a student at Claremont McKenna College, and Charles had asked some somewhat provocative question during, I think, the late-ish hype, 2020, 2021
Mm.
hype over George Floyd and the whole summer of protests and the racial justice movement. And nobody really spoke up in class. And one of the students came to his office hours, and Charles asked, what's up with this? No one really wanted to even talk about that question I raised. And he said, well, everyone's scared. And Charles said, well, are you scared of the administration? And he said, oh, no, no, no. We're scared of our fellow students and the kind of social mob mentality that has prevailed. And it's just, I mean, between Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, it seems to be ubiquitous.
No, it definitely is. And I think a big inflection point was in 2012, like after the like button was invented and social media became a lot more addictive. It wasn't just a feed of just pictures posted by your friends, but it really started attaching all these metrics to it. Metrics that kind of gave that little burst of dopamine to our brains that, oh, someone liked my photo. And that really just draws people back for more. And it created a really highly addictive business model then with their algorithms that now recommend things to you that aren't even necessarily from your friends, and the kind of infinite scroll. And so all of that kind of really started taking off in 2012. And as you mentioned, other apps started coming onto the scene. And now, most recently TikTok. But to your point about the social effect, the contrast is that one school that got rid of phones completely during the school day, it was in Michigan. They were kind of an early school district to do a phone ban. Basically, this one girl just shared that she feels like she can be herself at school now, and that she no longer spends an hour getting ready in the morning because she was so nervous about the things that she would do during the school day being captured and posted on social media by her peers. I think these kids have felt like they're just living under a microscope because you never know when someone could be recording you or taking pictures of you and posting them online. And that whole environment just infected the school day of just all these kind of metrics and likes, and everything is about what's happening in the kind of online virtual world. It was really just undermining kids' abilities to develop real friendships. And so it does kind of have this network effect, as Jonathan Haidt and others has called it, that the effects of social media are not just individual, but they change the whole group dynamics in a school or community.
Yeah, it's as if you took the social pressure that everyone experienced in middle school and preteen years and even into high school and made it 24/7 and worldwide. It seems, what could possibly go wrong?
That's right. Yeah. So I think that's been just some of the kind of main challenges then of social media has infected the learning environment and social environment for kids. And the social media use is really a problem during the school day. I can't even tell you the amount of teachers who say that even, it's on their phones, but even on the school issued devices, it's impossible to keep kids off of online games, social media websites, and sadly, even online pornography. There's some pretty horrifying statistics about the amount of kids that are watching pornography during the school day. And of that percentage, 40% were accessing it on the school issued devices. So it's really difficult for educators to effectively police these things in the classroom.
Yeah, I remember the anecdote from California. I don't know if it was LAUSD or where, but they had this allegedly these tablets that were locked down and you couldn't get on the wider internet, you couldn't search all this stuff, and I think it took the children a day to hack around it and get off all the protocols and be able to access almost anything.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're resourceful, those kids. But so I just want to, I'll open this up, of course, to Rick and Scott. Let's jump in at any time, but I want to ask you one more question.
Sure.
Claire, if we can steel man the opposite case, are there any robust benefits, even with all these negatives, to the introduction of screens in the classroom?
Benefits of the screens. I thought you were going to ask me benefits of phone bans, and I was ready to tell you how great phone bans are for kids, given
We'll
the
get there.
studies that have been done. Benefits of screens. I think the main benefit, to be honest, has been to the educators and school administrators, that it improves the speed at which teachers can grade and correct students' assignments. It's easier for parents then to access that information. And it has just kind of increased the speed and efficiency for the school in just so many administrative ways, that everything, all the grades, assignments, everything is just collected in kind of one portal that's very easy for people to oversee. And so I'm not sure that there's really been a benefit to the students themselves as much as it has benefited the educational system, which is one of the difficulties, as I've encouraged schools and school districts to think about moving away from so much screen-based learning, is that the system has now become so built around these devices. They're incredibly entrenched, just because, again, as I mentioned, schools have actually gotten rid of textbooks. Everything has gone onto the screens, which saves the school costs in different ways, and just makes it easier for teachers and administrators. And so that has been the main benefit, which is one of the reasons it's been difficult then to try to get schools to move away from the screens. And listen, I'm not anti-tech. I think kids can learn to use computers. Like, I had a computer lab class in high school, but this has now seeped into every subject matter. And I don't think kids need to be on screens to learn literature. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows actually kids, and this study came out actually from Columbia University, that kids comprehend text more deeply when they read it in print rather than on a screen. And so there's great value that's being lost, particularly in some of those subject matters that they should be engaging with a printed text, like the social sciences. So I can't say I have a lot of benefits from the student perspective as to the screens being put in classrooms.
Yeah, it's a tale as old as modern post-war public education. The first among equals at the table are really the teachers' unions and the administrators.
Mm-hmm.
Not surprising. Scott, you've been
How
chairman.
about this? How about this as a benefit? Real-time fact-checking of teachers.
Yeah. or the ability to press record, right?
Ooh.
To catch ideological excesses and indoctrination in live feed in the classroom. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Scott, I was going to say you've been chair of a classical school, private school, for a long time now. I think one of the previous episodes you said 20 years. I think. What has been your experience with this topic?
Yeah, so I have lots of practical experience. And one of the nice things about reading your report, Claire, is that it just totally jibes with our experience at the school. So
Mm.
3 years ago, we implemented a phone ban in the school. And the rule was the phones do not come inside the school. You can keep them in your car, you can leave them at home, but they don't come inside the school. And we did this for academic reasons because kids were looking at their phone in class, for social reasons because they would be spending time with the phone instead of with one another at lunch and things like that. And then also because there were just some things that bothered us about what they were doing. The classical school is based around the idea of Socratic discussions. And the kids would have their phones underneath the table and they'd be texting one another what to say and what they're going to say. And they'd start scripting the class in that way, whereas we like the spontaneous nature of the discussion.
Mhm.
So we implemented a ban and keep it in the car, keep it at home. That was basically the position. And I think you called that distance, which was one of the principles of a decent policy.
Mhm.
And then of course we got lots of complaints. Well, what if there's an active shooter situation? My kids will be able to do something with their phone, or how am I going to tell the kids that they need to pick up milk on the way home? Teacher or parents would have things that they would really want to be in constant contact with their kids, and those, so we just gave them workarounds and call the office if you need milk, and eventually people realize that they can give the kids a grocery list or something, and uh, then but some parents, and I would say it was wildly popular. Like 95% of people were just so happy that we did it because it relieved them of the burden of having to do it. Now, we were kind of the bad guys, and we're happy to do that, I suppose. Um, but there was a few parents here and there who just told their kids to defy the ban and put it in your locker, put it on mute, check it at 2 o'clock, and I'll tell you to pick up milk. Like that scenario, or that you need to pick up your brother and sister from a different place. And and then whenever that we catch that, we seize the phone, and the parents would have to come in and get the phone, and eventually that escalated. And that was another one of your principles, that there needs to be some sort of a consequences for a violation of the policy. And we did this 3 years ago, and we heard stuff like the first 2 months of implementing this ban, and I don't know that we've heard anything since, except from those who are kind of encouraging their kids to defy the rule, and just be very sneaky about it. Before this, we banned them and had them in the lockers. You could have them in the lockers, but then, like, what they do is start going out into the hallways and looking at their lockers. And instead of talking with one another at lunch, they'd be looking at phones in their lockers. So, we think it's been a great success, that it's really, the school had a pretty good vibe and a good culture beforehand, but it's really been one of the things that makes it distinctive, a great learning environment, a good social environment. It's really helped the culture of the school. And the kids are investing in one another, like it was 20 years ago. And so these things now have to be kind of artificially created, as opposed to just expecting them to arise spontaneously. The law needs to support the culture. And in this particular case, the rule, I think, supports the culture. So I really liked the report because it totally matched our anecdotal experience. And then now I discover it's science. So it must be true. And we appreciate the model legislation. And one of my questions, as I was thinking about it, was, I mean, it does work in a classical Christian school where the parents are very involved and they're very worried about overseeing their kids' character development and so on. And I wonder how how much that extrapolates to other school experiences. That is, if public school with their lesser parental engagement would have the same kind of results as a kind of much more hyper involved parents at a classical Christian school. It's maybe something we can talk about.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and share a little bit too on that note if of interest. So I did a lot of interviews for my forthcoming book, and I have a chapter specifically on schools. So this is my book called The Tech Exit, which the subtitle is A Practical Guide to Freeing Kids and Teens from Smartphones. So, but it comes out June 3rd, and I have a chapter specifically for schools and what they can do to help parents. And just like you were saying, Scott, like leaving it all on individual parents, particularly when there are collective aspects of these harms, when it affects everyone in a social environment like a school, is really difficult because then, individual parents are having to police this, but also even then those kids that are not on the phones are still left out of the social environment. Like you said, if every student's like going over to their locker during the passing periods, then the students that aren't on the phones are still left out of the social interactions. And so it is amazing that schools can provide such a collective solution. So all of that to say, I interviewed a school board member in Orange County, Florida, because this county, Florida passed the first kind of law in the United States to get phones out of schools. The law was limited to classroom time. They just said you can't have phones in the classroom. But Orange County went a step further and they said, you know what, we're going to just take them out of the entire school day. And the board member I happened to contact for an interview, this was totally serendipitous, said that she was initially opposed to the policy. She said that she was worried that students who feel socially awkward without their phones wouldn't know what to do. They'd feel lonely at the lunch table. And she said, I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong. And I've been completely wrong. And she said she was really convinced by teachers during these kind of school board discussions. They said, please don't allow them in the school day. You don't know how disruptive it is to my class just by students having access to these phones during lunch. That they come back to class and they're dealing with all these discipline issues, the things that have come up from the lunch period. So I wanted to say, she said that their experience has been overwhelmingly positive, and it's a public school district. And the New York Times did an article featuring the school, interviewing students who were saying that now they play pickleball during lunch. They organize game board events where they bring in a bunch of board games and just have like a competition kind of during lunch period. So the students have been very creative. And I asked her if she'd gotten pushback from parents, and she said, a couple of parents had some concerns about getting in touch with their student. And she said, but we worked through those, making sure you could get in touch with the school office. And she said, no, in fact, I've mainly heard from parents telling me, thank you so much for passing this policy. I can see the impact it's had on my kid, both socially, but also their grades improving. So I think that's just I would just say it matches, I think, your experience, Scott, and that's a public school system in Florida.
Rick, has this come up much in the James Q. Wilson K through 12 Education Center's work and research?
It's interesting. It's obviously on everybody's mind. The data on this is compelling. 6 to 7 hours a day for teens and tweens on devices. With girls, it's more social media. With boys, it's more gaming. The gaming thing's interesting because obviously that's more platform-based. That's your Xboxes and Nintendos. So that's less likely to be in their pocket and more likely to be at home in the evening. So the mix for boys and girls is different. But kids are getting 100 plus interruptions if they have a device during the day. So yeah, you can't avoid it. When you start talking, obviously, as has come up to, especially in public education settings, to superintendents, to principals, there's most parents haven't had the time or energy to really think deeply about all this. All their kids' friends start getting devices when they're 10 or 12. Parents don't want to be the SOB, as has come up. So it's real easy for parents to just say, all right, well, everybody gets it. I'll get it for you. And so there's a question of how do you change those dynamics and what role schools play. Schools don't want to be out front on this because the loudest parents on this tend either to be the parents that have been alluded to who say, they're worried about a shooting situation at school, or they're worried about a medical situation and they need to be able to talk to their kid because of allergies or because of medications or whatnot. And then on the other hand, Tiffany Justice, for instance, co-founder of Moms for Liberty, has made the point that she wants kids to have devices for what has come up, to be able to videotape problematic conduct in school, primarily on the part of educators. And so, the problem is probably 70, 80% of parents either don't have strong feelings on this or are fine with it, but there's 15 or 20% of parents who really want to be able to call their kid or text their kid. And those are the parents who tend to be loudest. So when you're contemplating this as school boards, when you're dealing with this as a principal, you tend to catch a lot of flack from these folks. And the folks who go, oh, yeah, that sounds sensible, tend not to speak up because it doesn't have any direct impact on them. This is actually one of the reasons why tackling this at a state level is so potentially powerful, because it then puts school boards, superintendents, principals in a position where they're saying, look, this has been argued out. Your elected representatives have made a decision. We're simply executing kind of state educational policy in a way that makes them less the bad guy in the equation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's get to the policy question at the state level. What's the best locus of policy making for this? Is it, we've talked about school boards, you have, Claire. Should it be the state legislature? You mentioned the Florida law should be a mix of the two. How should state legislators think about their role in this whole process?
I mean, I think ideally, just for the reasons mentioned, that it is, I think, states are responsible for the education in their state, and it is their authority in the state to oversee the education of the children in that state. And I think if it becomes apparent, like this evidence that we've been presenting, that the phones are really harmful to education, it is well within a state's power to pass a law, or in the case of Virginia, Governor Youngkin issued an executive order asking his Department of Education to investigate this issue and put out guidance for schools to follow. And, it was interesting. They kind of took a different approach than just passing it through the legislature, but they kind of went through the rulemaking process on this guidance, and they had listening sessions, and they heard from parents, and they heard from teachers. And so then they considered all that, and they basically issued their draft guidance, provided a period of public comment on that guidance, and then finalized the guidance at the end of this past year. And then it just went into effect in January. And where they came down was telling schools they needed to get phones out of the school day from bell to bell, which is, as I had recommended in my report, has just had the most positive outcomes of having no access during the school day whatsoever. And so that approach is a viable one as well. I think other states like Louisiana, I mentioned Florida, I know California, have all passed laws through their legislature, then signed by the governor, as another approach to say, we want our schools to go phone free from bell to bell. And I think what that really helps do is, as you all were mentioning, just the kind of taking the pressure off those at the more local level. So first, if you have it at the school level, you kind of remove that from parents. If you have it at the school board level, you remove it from the school principal. And then if you go even higher up to say it was an action of the governor or the state legislature, it does take some of that individual pressure off at the local level to say, listen, this is a policy across the state. And I think the more you can provide that collective solution, the better. And just to know that the end goal is improving education and improving student well-being. And it would be ideal to have that across the state, not just in different individual schools or individual school districts. And I actually think it's easier for parents and students to accept when it is done on such a broad level, because then their friends in the next town over are under the same policy. It's not like their kids are off the hook and get to have phones during the school day. So I personally think it's ideal to have a state level action. But in the meantime, what's so great is schools don't have to wait for that. School districts don't have to wait for that. They can adopt these policies earlier. And what I will just say to encourage schools and school districts is I've heard from people at the state legislature level or even at the school board level that what encouraged them to even adopt such a policy was having individual schools in their district that had already done this and seeing the positive results that school has experienced really kind of put the steel in their spine to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and pass this policy as a school board at a school district level, and then the same for a state level. And so it's actually important, just to have people championing this, even in their individual schools. They set an example, and they can actually spur higher level change.
Yeah. So just as the states are laboratories of democracy, so the school boards and
That's
independent
right.
school districts can be test cases for a lot of this stuff.
That's exactly what I was trying to say. You said it better than I could.
You're fine.
Yeah, and if I
Yeah.
could just, I want to hum in on that just for a second, because it's one of these policies, it's a little bit like grade inflation. It's difficult for one teacher to solve the problem. It's difficult to solve it in one classroom because the expectations that people have for standards of behavior are kind of cultural. You can have your own classroom, culture, but if you're a hard grader and everyone else is an easier grader, it affects the culture. It affects the selection of students that you have in your class. I mean, I would say the same thing for AI policies. If some, teachers, this is something that happens all the time at the university level. I mean, no one is in favor of cheating, but what's cheating? And now there's big debates about what cheating is. Well, you can do a first draft with AI, but I want to see you improve that first draft. And being the only teacher who no longer assigns papers and has blue book tests, like, I'm an outlier, right? But it's hard to have a culture it's hard to participate in a common culture when the rules are so different across the places. So at least schools have to have a common culture in that way. And presumably, like, the higher up you go, school districts would be better, because there's just a total collective action problem. And which is probably what happens in these schools that you're talking about, Claire, right? A couple teachers try to ban the phones in the classroom. They find it difficult because other teachers aren't banning them. It's actually a lot of work to ban them when you're the only one banning them. So, in order to make something more plausible and make something more possible, you have to have the entire school to get behind it.
Yeah.
So there's a couple things worth adding here. I mean, one is this point about how hard it is for individual teachers cannot be emphasized enough. When you've seen focus groups with teachers on this, in almost every case, a cell phone is the most valuable possession a kid owns. It is far and away kind of the best gift they've ever received. It's a strong part of their identity. To ask a teacher to confiscate a phone from a 14 or 15-year-old, and then much less when teachers have had somebody break in and steal a phone that's been confiscated, there's all kinds of liability issues. Teachers do not want to be put in that position. And they therefore tend not to enforce unless there is clear support coming from the school leadership and the district all the way down. But let's also make sure we're clear, because if we're talking to folks at the state level about potential legislation, it's really important to understand the Steelman case here. And I'm not sure we've articulated that fully enough. I mean, there's a couple of different things going on. One is particularly, we need to keep in mind for how long governors, blue and red, reformers, blue and red, have been telling schools to pursue device adoption. Jeb Bush wrote this op-ed at the beginning of the pandemic about how we need to embrace this opportunity. Folks like Bill Gates were writing the same thing in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. Like, we need to jump forward into the tech-enabled future. So what's happened is school districts have run with that. And partly they have embraced these learning management systems, as Claire noted, which run through pads. They run through Chromebooks. So what learning management systems do is all of the assignments, all of the homework, all of the feedback, all of the instructional resources. So districts were told this is cost effective. Let's stop wasting money buying those overpriced textbooks. Let's get stuff that can get updated, stuff where we can do real-time assessment. And so a lot of them have kind of figured out how do you wire your instructional strategy through this. Now, as parents, many of us hate it, because if you don't want your kid on iPads or Chromebooks and they come home, they have to be, because that's the only place they can do their homework. You can't do it away from it. But, it's important to make sure we're distinguishing between phone policy and broader concerns about kind of the integration of digital materials. Right. That's a harder thing to tease apart. On the phones in particular, what we're trying to do, I think, is get these perpetual distraction machines out of kids' hands so that they can actually engage. that is a more manageable ask than trying to figure out how do we unwind a lot of the tech. But
Yeah.
one of the hottest things in education tech circles is AI tutoring. This idea that a kid's phone will be able to provide them real-time support with math problems, with science problem, with writing. And so they're getting a lot of pressure from certainly the tech vendors, but also from, our over caffeinated, excited ed reform community about the opportunities presented. So legislators need to be prepared to have various serious conversations about the difference between phones in school and how do we approach that separately from some of these larger, very sensible issues Claire posed, but which are harder to unpack. And when folks start saying, yeah, but my kid needs their phone because that's their tutor, that's their explainer, that's their support system, how are legislators prepared to think about and talk about those issues and to address those effectively? They want to make sure they're sitting down with educators and thinking through what are the pedagogical implications of what we want to do.
No, that's great. Thank you for distinguishing those two things, because I think it is important. And I think the phones are the more pressing problem. And I think the easier to just address and say we should just get these out of the school day. And to me, that's just really a first step. And I think one that, as you mentioned, with kind of help from educators, if legislators are informed, they can actually help explain these policies to parents. Because I think a lot of times there's kind of common myths that parents are afraid of. And if it's just explained to them, here's ways that we're going to help your child. If they need to get in touch with you, it kind of puts them at ease. And so I do think it's important for legislators, educators to know how to explain some of these things to respond to parents' concerns.
And to be clear, I share a lot of Claire's concerns about the digitization of the classroom. I think the way Scott put it, there are real problems here. And it's one of the things that private schools are in a better position to address because they can say to parents and teachers, buy in or don't buy in. You don't have to come here. Public schools, it's more of a challenge, especially with straight procurement requirements and the rest. But, it's not that thinking about technological suffocation in classrooms is not a real concern, but we shouldn't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good when we first address cell phones, and then we can be more thoughtful, hopefully, about the role we want tech to play in classrooms going forward.
Well said.
Yeah, because it's an interesting point, Rick. Because you would think that especially at struggling schools, something like an AI tutor could be a real lifeline, especially for the more advanced students or for the students in a position to take full advantage of it. And it would be you wouldn't want to snatch that away from them, but you have to balance it with this. So the low hanging fruit, I think you both are saying is phones in the classroom. The rest is more complicated.
And it's what Claire and Scott said, right? Phones are distraction machines. They have been optimized. We have every movie ever made, every 6-second cat video, every possible chance to bully and insult that kid who annoys us. All of that is I don't know many adults over the age of 40 who can resist kind of looking at their phone every 6 minutes. So the idea that we're going to take only partially formed 14-year-old minds and expect those kids to just resist temptation for 6 or 7 hours a day is a ludicrous ask.
Yes. Can I just jump in on a point that I don't think has been mentioned yet that is worth drawing out, which is the kind of push to get screens in the classroom. Originally, this one laptop per child was to try to reduce this academic achievement gap between lower performing students who likely didn't necessarily have access to internet or technology at home, was the idea, and higher performing students from maybe more well-off families that had more access to technology and different resources. And so this one laptop per child was going to be what finally reduced the kind of academic achievement gap. And that hasn't panned out. But on a positive note, a solution that has been shown to help reduce that gap is smartphone bans. So in schools that ended up banning smartphones, they saw overall grades improved. But the most astounding finding was that it improved for the lowest quartile of kind of lower performing students. Those impacts in terms of the increase in grades and GPA more than doubled. So they saw the greatest improvement was in the kind of lowest quartile of students who had been struggling more. And so I think it just shows how distracting phones are. But then also just that this is actually a very practical policy solution to trying to help reduce some of the achievement gaps in education. And so I think that it's a point that I don't think it's discussed enough, but there is a justice kind of angle to this problem to say that allowing the phones in school is hurting the most vulnerable students the most. It's having the most negative impacts on those students that we're trying to help bring up their academic achievements. And so I think it's just worth noting that the more studies that come out, they show that not only is it improving students' grades overall, but it's particularly improving the kind of lower performing students.
Did our experience during COVID have any impact on how this debate is being shaped? I remember the one striking fact, not really closely relevant to what we've been discussing, but I just couldn't believe it, and so it's interesting. I think in LAUSD, that's Los Angeles Unified School District, I think at some point a few months into COVID, fully 40% of the students had never even logged on to the remote learning module that they were all supposed to be using to go to school. Yeah, COVID was kind of a shock therapy, more on the parent side for what the kids were learning, but of course it was all screen learning for a lot of school districts for the better part of a year or even 2 years some places.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the pandemic experience upended this conversation because it's tended to proceed in one way over the last 100+ years. We get excited about a new technology. It was radio 100 years ago. There was a U.S. Department of Education started before there was the cabinet agency. There was a U.S. Department of Education launched to support the radio. We were going to adopt it. There were millions of dollars in grants. The radio was sold as a textbook of the air. 20 odd states formally adopted it. Teachers were just going to have kids listen to the radio. The problem was you actually aligning your class with the right time the radio was on, controlling the bell schedule, sound quality, all of it. It was a nightmare. So that went away. And then we tried it again with TV in the 1960s. Under Kennedy, we had federal TV initiatives. It was promised that TV was going to drive educational improvement. So we go through this every so often. It never pays off. In the 80s, it was computers. In the early 2000s, it was one-to-one, initially with kind of laptops and then with pads. And look, so we have a long, bitter history of being disappointed by this, but nobody ever notices. Nobody ever remembers. What was different about the pandemic was suddenly parents were watching their kids be bored to death at the kitchen table. They saw that what got sold as quote unquote remote learning was in fact in no way, shape, or form a substitute for what kids weren't getting. It was dehumanizing, it was alienating, it was pointless. And that, I think, has meant for the first time, you're actually seeing scholars, you're seeing parents asking hard questions about the effect of tech on learning. Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge were raising these concerns prior to 2020. They were getting no traction. Over the last 5 years, you've seen them getting enormous traction, particularly with policymakers who are concerned about the effects on youth well-being, mental health, social connectedness. And so, in some sense, the pandemic was, a big bucket of water to the face in a way that has made it possible for legislators to start having a conversation, which was probably sorely needed in 2018 or 2019, but just wasn't feasible.
Yeah. And I think on the flip side of that, COVID also brought a lot more screen use into the home that parents have said is just different, is difficult to go back from. And so they said one mom I had interviewed for the book explained that, their school had the iPads, tablets, but they didn't use them that much before COVID. But then remote learning happened and they had to be used a lot. And so she thought, oh, well, we'll go back to school and we'll go back to kind of not using them very much. But she said that didn't happen. Now everyone was used to doing more on the screens. And so, in fact, they continued to use them more. And so her experience was that, unfortunately, the kind of ramping up of the screens during COVID has been difficult to then kind of taper back down, both school screens, but then also the kind of social screens. She said they had really successfully resisted a lot of screens for their kids, but then during COVID, there was nothing for her kids to do. So they started allowing their kids to use tablets or some different gaming apps with their friends. And it's been really hard to disentangle from that. And I think that's why this kind of phone ban approach is actually really helpful to parents to start saying, you know what, we're trying to put these technologies back in their proper place. We've been using them too much, and it hasn't been a good outcome for kids or for their relationships or their learning. And so I do think COVID did bring about, I completely agree with Rick's point. It brought about a lot of kind of awareness that parents just really didn't have prior to COVID in terms of what was happening on the screens. But on the converse, we did also see an increase in the kind of use and overuse of screens that is still taking time, I think, to taper back down to where it was before the pandemic.
Yeah, Rick, you raised an interesting point that, I want to raise this question. I think I know the answer, but it's good to talk it through a little bit. I mean, you mentioned radio, TV, even computers, but I think from my sense of just a layman's perusal of the social science research and psychological research from Haidt and others, that, I mean, smartphones and tablets, especially conjoined with social media and TikTok, I mean, those are sort of a qualitative difference. I don't want us to, because I think the average technologist would say, look, you can't resist change. You guys would have been against the horse and buggy in a different context. This is coming. We have to figure out how to use it. But it seems like there's a qualitative difference from the previous iterations of tech in the classroom going back a century and this new sort of uh, untrod ground of AI, social media,
Mm.
rapid fire content in 20, 30-second intervals, and more mundane things like television screens and a VHS tape or radio announcements or even radio learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I usually argue, look, it's in three dimensions. One, it's portable, so it's with you all the time, which is very different from like your old VCR or TV set. Two, it's connective. You're connected to every movie ever made. You're connected to everybody you want to bully, to everybody you want to meet up with, after school. And three, it's optimized for distraction. It's driven by algorithms. It throws things in front of you constantly that it thinks will amuse you. These are all fundamentally different from every one of those other technologies you mentioned. These have had huge impacts on adult well-being, on
Mhm.
adult habits, behaviors. Just think about how absolutely profound the change is for kids, especially in a learning environment where
Mhm.
concentration is at a premium. On the Luddite point, one of my favorite stories on that stuff is always that remember when the pencil eraser was introduced in the 19th century. When the pencil eraser was introduced, educators were furious because the problem was the eraser meant that you could get rid of mistakes. And this was going to have a hugely adverse impact on the moral formation of kids because they would come to believe that it was okay to make mistakes. So, like, look, what part of the problem is there are reasonable, thoughtful, sensible parents and lawmakers who are like, guys, look, you guys have always freaked out about tech. Why are you freaking out again? And what we need to articulate is, yeah. It was fair to say freaking out about the pencil was stupid. This is a different story. And here's why it's a different story. And here's why, in order to kind of do right by our kids, we need to put in place guardrails that are going to allow them to have the kind of educational opportunities that we want for them.
Two quick stories to underscore Rick's point there. The first is a teacher I interviewed was explaining that he has seen what he calls like the TikTokification of the kind of media and kids' attention spans. That he said it used to be if he showed like a video clip from a movie for like 5 minutes in class that could kind of like reset everyone's attention, re-engage the students who were lulling off after their lunch break. And he said now a 5-minute movie clip is too long to hold the attention spans of his students because they are used to 30-second reels on TikTok. And so just the nature of this technology, and particularly how it's undermining students' abilities to focus and sustain attention on a subject, is really dangerous. And the second point is that there was an article probably about 2 years ago in the Wall Street Journal called "I Wish College Was More Like Prison." It had a very provocative title, but it was about a college professor who was teaching a college class to prison inmates. And she explained that these prison inmates don't have access to phones, they don't have access to social media. And she could teach them for 2.5 hours, and they would engage with these really great texts of literature, ask amazing questions. She just had the most amazing time teaching this group of prison inmates. And she said, in contrast, her colleagues on the college campus were struggling to hold their college students' attention for an hour and 15-minute lecture. And they were, exchanging tips on, oh, well, have you tried doing this PowerPoint thing? And swipe in some images, and just struggling to figure out how to sustain college students' attention for an hour, 15-minute lecture. And so I think that just really underscores the point of how these technologies have totally undermined students' ability to focus and sustain attention on subjects in the learning environment. And so it was really a provocative thing to think about. Are prison inmates almost really the most free, in a sense, of these digital technologies that are really enslaving our brains in other ways? So anyway, this is an interesting thought experiment for you all, but I think that just underscores Rick's point about the nature of this technology being very different than the past.
Yeah, and I want to underline that too. To me, the number one issue is the undermining of attention. It undermines the ability to read. It undermines even the ability to write. It actually mirrors kind of vices that you don't have self-control because you're addicted to these things and want to know how like your photos are doing on social media or something like that. And so just requiring, I mean, I've done this for a decade in my classes, no technology in the class. Like, you have to buy the book. If you don't buy the book, I'm going to give a quiz. And the first question on the quiz is going to be, what's the first word on page 3? You're not going to do well. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of brains to answer the question, but it does require that you actually get the book. And because I want to be able to teach Aristotle, I want to be able to teach Dostoevsky. And you can't do that unless people are willing to focus and read. And I can't control how they do homework or anything like that, but you can get involved, I think, in trying to lengthen their attention spans. And that to me is like the number one thing about having an environment that does not have the phones or even the other technologies in it, because it eliminates distractions. Or I shouldn't say it eliminates distractions. You're left with the old world distractions of, how do I look, and what am I going to do after class, and do I have to go to the bathroom, or I'm really thirsty. Like, those are nice things. Those are the old vices that we still have to fight when we're in class. So I think it's difficult to maintain that stuff alone. But I've noticed that many other professors do the same thing. And anyways, I think that's really the crucial moral and intellectual virtue that is undermined by the social media and the phones in the class. So, and you know what?
Yeah.
Here's the other question that's kind of been left unanswered. Like, should teachers be allowed to have the cell phones in the class? Because they're human. They set a standard in the classroom. And if they can, like, have the kids do some work while they surf on their phone, um, does that undermine their own ability to lead a classroom, or or is it irrelevant to the question? What has happened, Claire, in those school districts that have banned phones for students? Have they done it for teachers?
I haven't. Okay, I'll tell you. The only example I know of is a private school, and they decided to actually, in order to kind of get this effort going, and it's a boarding school, so the students live there. They actually they got a discount deal with the Light Phone company. Have you heard of the Light Phone? It's like an alternative to a smartphone for faculty and students. And a teacher reported, I think it was in the Washington Post, or the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, one of those papers interviewed the kind of students and teachers at this school called the Buxton School in Massachusetts. It's a little bit of a kind of alternative school model, but the teacher said he didn't realize how distracted he had been during class just by, honestly, even just the mental distraction of thinking, has someone texted me or, done something on the phone? Like it is very mentally distracting. But he said having the light phone, which is just, it gives no notifications. It's very boring to look at, just calls and texts, really freed him up. He felt like to be a better teacher in the classroom. So I don't think adults are immune from the effects of these technologies. And I think it is interesting. Obviously, teachers and students don't necessarily have to have the same standard, but I do think the point of modeling for the students is a really important one. And I think, schools could issue guidance to teachers to say, we'd really encourage you to have your phones out of the, in a desk or out of the kind of classroom so that you can focus on the students, because it does have benefits to teachers as well, for sure.
Yeah, I remember putting Instagram on my phone mostly to follow pictures of my sister's kids and their business. It was like kind of fun boutique donut shop and just harmless stuff like that. But Instagram has gotten very TikTokified, and about 4 years ago, I noticed that I clearly was getting stupider and my attention span was declining. So I just took it off the phone, and I as you said, Rick, anyone under 40 or 45 has some of the same problems with this kind of dopamine and algorithm driven, really sort of technology short video ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have we left anything out, Claire? Do you have, do you have sort of a top 3 steps to tech exit in schooling or more broadly?
Yeah,
I
we
mean,
focus on
the smartphone is the low hanging fruit, as we've established.
it is. No, and I would just say, definitely feel free to read the book. It's mainly directed at parents and families and what they can do. But on the school front, I think, and this has come up in what Scott was saying, just going phone free. The big things to remember are just doing it bell to bell. Allowing it during passing periods or lunches and recesses does not have the same impact. And that's been shown in the studies. It's just they're not as effective in their results for students. And then also just thinking of ways to increase the distance between student and phone, like asking them to leave it, not bring it to school, or having it away from them in a stored location for the day. Because brain studies show that the mere presence of a phone, even if it's in a backpack or something, is still mentally distracting to the student. So the greater the distance, the better. And then you just have to back it up with consequences. I think schools really have to think through. And I know, Rick, you mentioned this as well. You need that top-down support from school leadership. Leaving it to individual teachers to police is incredibly difficult. But if a school administration shows it's going to take this seriously and have consequences like a detention or other action, that they kind of crack down hard on that first instance, they've seen success then in students really abiding, by the policy. So, I would just say that I think it's very doable. Schools shouldn't be afraid to just start doing it, even if your district or your state hasn't gone phone free. Just know that you can really inspire higher level change, and that at the end of the day, it's going to be the best result for students. And so, I think and schools can do a lot to come alongside parents and provide that collective solution that really individual parents really desire. So, that would be my last word is do it. It's not that hard, and everyone will be the better for it. So.
Yeah, I just want to plug your book one more time. So Clare Morell has been speaking to us, as well as Rick and Scott. And what's the title of the book again, Claire? It'll be in the show notes. But
Oh, yeah, thank you. It's The Tech Exit, a practical guide to freeing kids and teens from smartphones. It's out June 3rd.
Excellent. We'll have to pick it up. Maybe we'll review it in the Claremont Review Books.
Please do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're right up on an hour. I just want to thank you, Rick and Claire and Scott, for joining us again for the Cincinnatus series, and thank everyone for joining us too. If you want to learn more about Claremont's work, go to claremont.org. Check out all of our work out of the DC Center on policy at dc.claremont.org, and then check out the 2 publications, claremontreviewbooks.com and americanmind.org. And we will wrap up this special short series next week with talk about red state strategy, sort of more general. Thank you all, my guests, and thank everyone for joining. Talk to you soon.